It's been a while since I showed you my progress on my Nurgleneth army. I've covered how I built my Tree Revenants, Kurnoth Hunters, and Warsong Revenant, but the only piece missing was my Alarielle. So, in this video, I'll be showing you how I built and painted my Nurgle corrupted Alarielle. I really wanted this conversion to be the centerpiece of my army. I wanted it to be recognizable as Alarielle, but it needed to be the most corrupted looking miniature in my army. So, to resolve this, I decided to forgo Alarielle's usual beetle and replace it with the third brother of the Glotkin, Gurek Glot. The problem would be combining these while still keeping that Sylvaneth theme. As such, I'll be giving this guide the full 5 dead animal bits out of 5. It will feature sculpting, parts from a number of sets, as well as quite a bit of adjustment work. To begin, I set about removing the components from their sprues and cleaning up the components of any mold lines or injection points, beginning with the Glotkin. Once the components had been cleaned, I started my assembly. I followed the instructions here up until the point where I built the right arm. Instead of completely assembling the lamprey-like arm, I omitted the central piece that featured most of the teeth. The reason for this was to allow me to add a hand. This hand was sourced from the Great Unclean One kit, specifically Roticus's right hand, which was carrying the small staff. I thought it would make for a much cooler version for my Glotkin to be carrying a giant sword, and this staff would serve as the basis for a wooden handle. It just needed to be trimmed down a little. I started this off by removing most of the branches with my clippers, before shaving this down and generally cleaning them up with my knife. With the staff cut down to a more handle-like size and appearance, I assembled the hand together. From here, the hand could be compared against the arm. A few of the remaining teeth were protruding a little too much. These were cut back until the hand was fitting a little more snugly against the wrist. But I didn't attach it to the arm just yet. First, I needed to attach the sword. This blade was sourced from the Tree Lord kit and was chosen for 2 distinct reasons. First of all, it would help to tie the model back into the Sylvaneth theme, and also, when I came to paint the model, I could give it a really strong contrasting colour. After removing the blade from the hand and doing a little cleanup, I then glued the sword to the hand, positioning it in a way that the sword was being held in a reversed grip. With the sword in place, the hand was almost ready to be attached, but there was still quite a few large gaps between the arm and the hand. The ever-useful green stuff would be called upon to pick up the slack here. I cut and mixed up a small amount before adding a lump of it to the hand. This was then pressed into the wrist, with the green stuff acting as a temporary adhesive and allowing me to position the hand as I desired. Once I was happy with the position, I began to add more green stuff around the hand, using it to fill in any gaps and to further lock in the hand into position. With the gaps roughly filled, I took my sculpting tool and used this to blend the green stuff into some more realistic folds and creases. During this process, I made sure to use some Vaseline over my tools. This just prevented the putty from sticking as I worked with it, and resulted in some smoother textures. With the hand finished, I could continue assembling the Glotkin until I reached this stage. While I waited for that green stuff to cure, I began to work on my Alarielle. Like with the Glotkin, I began by clipping away all the components required to build the Sylvaneth Queen herself, before cleaning them up of the mold lines and tabs. Rather than just attaching Alarielle to the back of Gurek, I decided to make a few changes to her. I wanted these to be quite subtle though, as I still wanted her to be immediately recognisable. The first of these changes involved adding a small amount of green stuff to the face in order to make the cheekbones a little sharper. This will create a more gaunt appearance and feed into that diseased aspect of Nurgle. A small blob of green stuff was added to the cheek and then blended downwards so that it appeared more pronounced at the top. This was repeated until both cheeks had been modified. To get across that rotten and decaying look, I chose to add some corrosion to Alarielle's crown. Using my pin vise, I created a series of small 1mm holes, with some being enlarged by using some larger drill bits afterwards. These holes and pockmarks were also continued across other parts of Alarielle's armour, finishing off that eroded and oxidized metal look. Continuing with the damage, I next clipped and cut several tears into some of the cloth areas, helping to further that slightly more dishevelled look. You may notice that all of these changes were made to the individual components. This tends to be much easier than making them to already assembled parts. But now that my clipping and trimming was finished, I could glue her together. Okay, so at this stage, I had the Glockkin and Alarielle, and I somehow needed to join them together. What made the most sense here was to simply use the original branches that Alarielle would normally stand upon to create a level surface. But inevitably, the branch wouldn't fit against the Glockkin's back without a little cutting and trimming first. This only went so far though, because both surfaces were fairly irregular. Getting a good bond between the two would be very tricky. So I opted to use pinning. I drilled a 1mm hole into both the underside of the branch and the Glockkin's back. Into these, I superglued 1mm wire and trimmed it down to a usable length before gluing this protruding wire into the one in the Glockkin. This resulted in a much stronger bond, which is especially important for protruding parts such as these. With the branch in place, I brought in Alarielle to check how she could be placed on the back. For the most part, it was working out quite well, but I did need to clip and trim back parts of the back in order to create a flatter surface. With this done, I then drilled more holes into Alarielle's foot and into the point where it would be attached onto the Glockkin's back. Into Alarielle's foot, I attached some more wire, but I didn't glue it into the back just yet. I wanted to keep her separate to make painting her much easier later on. But before we go on with the conversion, let's hear a little bit about the sponsors of today's video, HelloFresh. When I'm not working, I'm probably spending my time kitbashing or editing these videos, so the quick, easy and affordable meals from HelloFresh are perfect for me. HelloFresh offers a wide variety of quick and easy recipes, including 20-minute meals, easy cleanup and low prep options. HelloFresh has helped me to free up the time it would normally take me to come up with a meal idea and go and actually get those ingredients, which just means more time for kitbashing. I get all of these fresh ingredients delivered straight to my door. Another major benefit is that everything is already portioned out, which means everything gets used and there is much less waste. Since using HelloFresh, I hardly have any food waste anymore, but if you don't believe me, even the University of Michigan says that HelloFresh cuts down on your food waste by at least 25% when compared to grocery shopping. Most importantly, it tastes great too. HelloFresh has got more 5-star reviews than any other meal kit, so you know you'll get something delicious. Produce gets from the farm to your doorstep in under a week, so you know that it's going to be at peak freshness. But what's great about getting sponsored by HelloFresh is that we've already been having meals from them for the past 6 months. Before HelloFresh, we used to get stuck in a rut of eating the same boring meals week in, week out. But since signing up, we've enjoyed so much more variety. All of these recipe cards are all different meals we've had and enjoyed. It's been great to try out new meals and things that we would never have tried cooking before. But don't just take my word for it. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code WARGAMER16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Once again, that's HelloFresh.com and use code WARGAMER16 for up to 16 free meals and free surprise gifts. Big thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. By this point in the build, the Glockkin was pretty much complete, with only a few aesthetic touches left to be added. The first of these was the second branch from Alarielle's kit, which, after a little trimming, was placed around one of the large protruding horns. Similarly, some more tree lore components, particularly the ones which featured branches and leaves, were also glued into the spots where the other Glockkin brothers would normally stand. Finally, these horticultural improvements were rounded off by adding a few protruding roots to the left arm. I created these from rolling out small lengths of green stuff. After being attached to the surface, texture was added along with some adjustments to their position. The final modification to make was to Alarielle's wings. Again, this was the perfect place to add a little Nurgle corruption, and so I chose to replace her regular wings with a pair taken from some plague drones. After a quick comparison to check the position and angle, I removed the small ball joint from each wing and cleaned up the cut. From here, I drilled a hole into the base of each wing before repeating this against the torso itself. Some wire was glued and trimmed as I had done previously. I did one final dry fit to make sure that everything was lining up correctly, and once I was happy, I glued them into place. This completed the conversion, which meant that the only thing left to do at this point was to paint. Being such a large model, I opted to use my airbrush. This would make painting such a large area faster and much easier. I began with the primer, choosing to use some of Pro Acryl's black-brown primer, mixing in just a little thinner to help it through the nozzle. With this, I primed both the Glock in half as well as Alarielle, ensuring that I got into all those nooks and crannies. Continuing with the airbrush, I replaced the black-brown primer with some dark purple and a little thinner. I used this to create the base colour for the flesh of the Glockkin, continuing the purple theming that I'd used across the rest of the army. While applying this, I tried to focus my application from above to ensure that the black-brown areas was retained in the deepest recesses, creating the appearance of shadows. But apart from that, I made sure to give all the flesh areas a good solid base colour of this dark purple. To create some highlights, I mixed in a little magenta to my original dark purple to create a lighter shade whilst maintaining a vivid colour. I applied this as before, but reduced my area of coverage, focusing the paint onto just the upper parts. This started to create a gradient going from the black-brown to the dark purple to the magenta as it moved out from the recesses. This would really help to emphasize the details on the model and would be something I'd be building on in the next couple of steps. For the next airbrush highlight, I dumped out my paint and replaced it with some pure magenta and focused this to an even smaller area than before. The problem with airbrushing is that while you can get some nice smooth gradients, the smaller details can often get missed. The skin surface had a lot of texture that was being missed, so to resolve, I opted to dry brush a mixture of magenta and olive flesh. This involves taking a fairly large brush. I'm using my Artis Opus Series D here and loading it up with some paint before working the paint through the bristles and removing some of the excess. With the brush prepped, I lightly dragged it across the model. This caused the paint to only form on the raised edges and details. As I'd used a much lighter paint, this helped them to contrast against the darker colours around them. For the sharper details that the dry brushing didn't quite catch, I opted to use my regular brush and pick them out with an edge highlight. In addition to the highlights and edge detailing, I also applied this paint over the various boils and pustules that litter the Glockkin's body. This would serve as the basis for a wash that I'd be applying later on. The next areas to tackle were the horns emanating from the Glockkin's back, as well as the various branches that I'd added. The purple airbrushing had overspilled onto these and other areas a little bit. So, before I started, I wanted to return them all to the original black-brown colour. I thinned out my paint with a bit of water to help it flow a little easier and applied some thin layers until I achieved that solid colour. In much the same way that I built up some gradients with my airbrush, I wanted to do the same over the horns, but using a regular brush. Using some water-thinned dark umber, I applied a thin layer to the horns and branches, but avoided painting the undersides and recessed parts of these areas. To get smooth gradients here, the trick is to just apply several thin layers of paint, allowing them to dry fully between applications. With each subsequent layer, you just reduce the size of the area that you're covering until you achieve a solid colour over the upper sides. To bring out the details in these areas, I used some light umber to pick out the raised parts, focusing on the sharper edges and finer points. To finish off the branches and horns, I applied some very small dots of bright warm grey. These were focused to only the corners and sharpest points of detail. For the various teeth and skulls littered across the model, I approached them in much the same way as the wooden areas. I began with a base coat of dark golden brown, before applying a few thin layers of dark golden brown mixed with a little yellow ochre, and then finally highlighting just the edges with some yellow ochre. To create some strong contrast against the dark purple and browns, I chose to paint the sword using some bright yellow green. If you've seen my previous Nurgleneth videos, you'll already be familiar with this process, but to summarise, I started by using my airbrush to apply some bright yellow green across the sword. I applied this in a kind of zigzag pattern, so that one side of the sword was dark and the other opposite side was green. I built up these applications steadily in order to create some gradients. You'll notice that I masked off areas around the sword here too. This just helped to prevent any potential overspray. Once these were completed, I then highlighted the edges of the blade using some more bright yellow-green, which helped to convey a degree of sharpness to these details and gave the blade a more magical appearance. Finally, I created a heavily watered-down mixture of the paint, to the point where it had the consistency of a wash. I then used this to pick out the various cracks in the horns and the markings carved into the skin. By creating a wash, the paint flowed directly into these recesses and pulled away from the raised surfaces. As it dried, it gave the appearance of an oozing, glowing ichor that was seeping out of these fissures. To paint the leaves that feature across some of the branches, I mixed in a little transparent green into some more bright yellow-green to create a darker tone. This mixture was first dry brushed onto the fur-like texture that sat at the base of the horns. By using green though, it gave them the appearance of moss rather than fur. Following this, the mix was then applied to all of the individual leaves scattered across the branches. With some pure bright yellow-green, I applied a second lighter dry brush to the moss, just to pick out some of the raised details, before then highlighting the edges of those leaves. Golden yellow was then used to pick out only the very tips of the leaves before being watered down to a wash and applied into those recesses that I'd tackled earlier. With this being a brighter paint, I reduced my area of coverage, focusing mainly on the central parts of these areas. For the metal areas of the model, I created a wash by mixing some turquoise with plenty of water. This was then applied over the metallic areas to create the effect of oxidized bronze. So that the verdigris appeared to have formed in the recesses, I began to paint on some bronze, focusing mainly on the raised areas so the turquoise was still visible. To highlight the edges of the metal, I used some light bronze. To paint the leather straps, I began with a layer of dark umber, keeping the black-brown still visible in the recesses. To highlight this, I created a mixture of dark umber and burnt orange. Finally, some small dots of burnt orange were applied as an extreme highlight. Over such a large area, the purple tone could do with being broken up a little with some variations. For this, I grabbed some transparent red. Without thinning though, it can be very strong, so I applied plenty of water. As there are a number of tentacles dotted about the model, including the giant one that made up the left arm, these seem to be the best places to focus my efforts. I applied my thin mixture so that it subtly adjusted the tone, building this up over several layers until they had a stronger red coloration. In a similar method, I also watered down some transparent yellow and applied this over the boils and pustules that I base coated earlier on. Over the light colour, the yellow could really stand out and gave them a pus-filled appearance. Painting Alarielle's skin was done in much the same way as I tackled the Glotkins. Instead of purple though, I created a 50-50 mixture of black-brown and olive flesh, and used this as my first layer. To build up the highlights, I then added more olive flesh to the mix in order to lighten it up. This was then lightly sprayed over the skin. The airbrushing was then finished off with a layer of pure olive flesh, covering an even smaller area than with the first two layers. To give the skin a slightly purplish hue, I created a mix of transparent purple and olive flesh, which created this lilac colour. I mixed in a little water to create a glaze that I painted directly into some of the recesses. By keeping the mixture thin, I could apply several layers and slowly build up the colour. The last thing left to do when painting Alarielle's skin was to give only the most prominent details a thin edge highlight of olive flesh. For Alarielle's dress, I opted for a dark blue cloth colour, and so chose to start off with some blue-black. By mixing in some pale yellow to the blue-black, I created a lighter mixture that I could apply as a layer. Further pale yellow was added, which allowed me to use this as an edge highlight. To paint the cloth around Alarielle's face, I began with some dark, warm grey. Like with the dress, pale yellow was added to the base colour. This was first used as a layer before adding further pale yellow to create the highlights. All that was left to do then was to tackle the remaining areas of the model in the same way that I painted the same details on the Glotkin. This included the metal areas, the leaves, the wood, and finally the spear. Once all of these areas had been completed, all I needed to do was to finish off the base in the same way I tackled the rest of the army before attaching Alarielle, which left me with the following. And here we have the finished Alarielle, the leader and centerpiece of my Nurgleneth army. I'm incredibly happy with the result. It really brings a huge amount of Nurgle theming to my force, while still being easy enough for my opponents to recognize who she is on the tabletop. Although the model is taller than the original, Age of Sigmar isn't quite as strict about line of sight. If the model is a monster, you can always see it behind terrain, so the additional height isn't really an issue. With the completion of this miniature, my initial 2,000 points of Sylvaneth are now fully built and painted, but I'm sure that there will be more additions to be made in the future. If you enjoyed this guide, please do check out my previous guides from the series, which I'll include a link to above. I'll include all the paints used in this guide in the description, along with some affiliate links, so if you're looking to try out some of these things for yourself while supporting me in the process, I would be extremely grateful. Speaking of which, let me just say a huge thank you to my ever generous supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Seth Sewell, Ryan Little, Tim, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Limborg, Mr. Grimm, and Swedsman. So a big thank you to you guys. And if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, YouTube membership, or you just use my affiliates links, then it is the kind-hearted people such as yourselves that allow me to fund the tools and paints required to build these bigger conversion guides for you. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.